Okay. Welcome to 90 and a Little Extra, the story series. My name is Adeyemi Adesanya, and should I call it a beautiful day in Lagos? It's raining today, and I'm extremely excited to welcome, without a shadow of doubt, one of the foremost, probably a legend as well in international football commentary, the one and only Derek Rae. If you followed football, the Champions League in the 90s, on ESPN with a certain Thomas Smith with a Y. If you play FIFA, he is the voice that you listen to. Welcome to 1982 Extra, Derek Rae. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, Adeyemi. I'm talking to you from my home in Massachusetts on the east coast of the USA. Spring has arrived. It's beautiful outside. And I'm wearing, as you can see, a Super Eagles shirt in honor of Nigeria. So all is well with the world.
Like I said, if you were going to vie for political office today, with what you have done, you will be perfect. You'll get all the votes. You've played into the hearts of Nigerians with what you've just done.
Well, I have very fond memories of covering Nigeria in World Cups. In fact, I was with the Super Eagles way back in '94, the first time, but not as a broadcaster. In fact, as an organizer, as the media officer for the organizing committee here in Boston. So it's something that's deep-seated with me.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. So you probably kind of had first-hand access and information, because a few Nigerians that attended that World Cup didn't have that kind of access.
Yeah, I mean, what I found was that it was a great experience to be around Nigeria, and obviously Clemens Westerhoff was the manager back then, and it was such a talented squad, so many excellent players. One of them, a friend of mine, Efen Okoku, who I've worked with on many occasions on television, and it was just a great story at the time because we all expected great things from Nigeria, and of course they delivered really in that World Cup. And it would be strange nowadays to have a World Cup without the Super Eagles being part of it.
That's quite high praise to say. It would be strange to have a World Cup without the Super Eagles. That's as good as saying it would be strange to have a World Cup without Brazil or Germany.
Yeah, well, I mean, you need Brazil and Germany, but I do think that you need Nigeria. I think a certain generation, and I'm obviously a little bit on the older side, but younger people now, I think, fully expect Nigeria to be in every World Cup.
Well, if only we can get our house in order to get things done the right way, we would be able to achieve that. But let's get down to it. So quickly, tell us, one or two people might be new to you here. Who's Derek Rae?
Well, he's from Scotland, originally from Aberdeen, northeast of Scotland, and grew up as a football-crazy youngster, like most people in Aberdeen, like most people in Nigeria. And I kicked the ball around as a young person, like most people do, but not to a particularly high level. But my dream from a young age was to be a commentator. I knew that from very early on, going back to the 1974 World Cup, when I heard all these other commentators doing the job from West Germany. And I think I thought to myself, yeah, I would like to be a commentator someday. And we had just bought our first recording device in Aberdeen at that time. And we had a portable version as well. And I would put that to good use. I would walk around and just commentate on matches in the playground or in the street. And then later I would go to reserve games at Aberdeen, my local club, and then to first team games. And what you have to understand about that period is that Aberdeen were about to become the best club side in Europe. It's hard for a younger person now to imagine that.
Yeah,
but Aberdeen won the Cup Winners' Cup in 1983, beating Real Madrid no less in the final. And our manager, you might have heard of him because he went on to some pretty spectacular things, a guy called Alex Ferguson. So that's really where the Fergie legend was born, was with Aberdeen. And I was just so fortunate to live through that. And I would commentate for the local hospital radio station in my teens. And then I moved on to BBC. To BBC Scotland as one of the commentators there. Moved to the USA several years later. ESPN, you mentioned, that was a huge part of my life, the Champions League coverage. I've worked for numerous other broadcasters. Nowadays I'm freelance, which allows me to bounce between different entities. I work for the Bundesliga a lot as one of their voices in Germany. I travel to Germany quite a bit too. So basically, Derek Rae is a huge football fan, I'm sure, like everybody else watching this, and I've just been lucky enough to live the dream.
Oh, interesting. So let me ask you, your early career life, you've already chronicled the process. So can you remember the first game that you did?
As a commentator?
As a commentator, yes.
Well, the first game that I did as a professional commentator was a game between two Scottish clubs, Kilmarnock and Dumbarton. Now, I did have lots of experience before that as an amateur commentator. So the first game that I did just talking to myself was a game between Aberdeen and Airdrie many years before that. But as a professional, 1986, Kilmarnock against Dumbarton. But there's a good story to this one. My hero, my broadcasting hero, was a fellow called David Francie. And everybody in Scotland knew David Francie. He had a distinctive voice, a great presence. I idolized him. And I'd been in communication with him just to get advice over a number of years. And he would send me back some great advice. And it turned out that one of the texts I sent him was 19. Instead of just sending me back advice, he actually gave it to his bosses at the BBC. And so they called me down to Glasgow, the headquarters, for a chat and said, if there's a chance, we'd like put on air sometime. Well, the chance came a few weeks later because David, my hero, had picked up a knee injury and couldn't do the game. So I got this opportunity because of him. And there's a second part to the story. They then said to me after the first game, they said, we thought you did well. We wonder now if you would like to accept our second invitation, which is to go to Wembley this midweek and broadcast England against Scotland, the oldest international fixture that there is, because David is not fit to return to the commentary box. So my second game on air was England against Scotland at Wembley. I'd never been to Wembley. I'd never even been to an England-Scotland game.
The first trip to Wembley was to work. It wasn't for leisure, but to work.
Correct.
Interesting. Interesting. So for a lot of people who want to become commentators, can you take us through the work, the preparation that goes into getting ready for a match?
Yeah, the preparation is extensive. And I always say to people who want to get into the business, you absolutely have to prepare. Fail to prepare, prepare to fail. That's the saying that we like to use in the business. And what I usually do is once I know that I have a particular game assignment, and that might be 3 months before the game, it might be 3 weeks before the game, it just depends on who I'm working for, I just start scribbling. And I'm quite old school. I just take a piece of paper and I divide it down the middle. And on the left-hand side, I write about the home team. And on the right-hand side, the away team. And I do it all in colours. So if it were, say, Manchester United against Everton, then I would do Manchester United on the left in red. I would do Everton on the right in blue. And I've got my own system, so I do my players on the top half of the sheet and I do all the other notes on the bottom. And it just starts with going back to previous times when I've commentated on these teams and refreshing my memory. And I'm also a languages student, so I studied German at a young age. One of the things I took from languages studying was that if you write something down, and I mean write it down and not on a computer, but actually write it down, it does stay in the memory much longer and much more efficiently. So I sort of took those techniques into how I prepare for games. And I've been preparing that way my whole career. A lot of people have said to me, oh, you're stuck in the 1980s. You need to get with the modern program. But I've never changed because it works for me. And I think that's the important thing, is that we all prepare in our own way, in a way that suits our personalities. And the point is to make sure that you have the information up here come match time. But I love the preparation, honestly. It's quite a lonely thing because you're working solo. I mean, I sit here in this office where I'm talking to you now. I just sit here and read and watch old games and prepare, and you just immerse yourself in the two teams so that hopefully by the time the match comes around, you are ready for the test.
So interestingly, you say you speak German?
Yes.
And you studied German. So if I were to ask, how many other languages do you speak besides English and German?
Well, German is the one I speak fluently. English, of course, and well, some people would say Scottish is its own language, and who am I to disagree with that? That certainly can make a case. French I also studied at school, although my French proficiency is nowhere close to my German fluency. Spanish is a language I taught myself. In fact, I mentioned the World Cup in 1994. You might remember Nigeria in the group in the Boston Foxborough venue had Argentina. And I didn't speak a word of Spanish at that time. So I just took it upon myself to go to an evening class in the Boston area and do some rudimentary Spanish. And through working with a lot of South American broadcasters, especially at ESPN, I found it quite handy. And I sort of just taught myself the rest of it. As I say, it's not fluent, but I can speak enough Spanish and certainly enough football Spanish that it's useful on match day.
Wow. So you have German, English, Scottish, French, Spanish. So that's as good as 5 languages.
It's helpful to have it.
I'm thinking in my head, you get lost in, okay, which one do I go with now? Which one do I go with now? Okay, I'm stuck in German now, so I switch to English. Do you get stuck in between languages at times?
Less so with German, because I studied German so young. I can almost flick a switch, and when I go to German, there are times when I even dream in German because it's so ingrained. It's true. I always say to people that once you dream in a language, then you probably are entitled to say that you've come close to mastering it. With the other languages, I have to think much more. So I was in France, for example, again covering Nigeria for the Women's World Cup last year, and while I was in France, I found I had to think a bit more because my French is probably the rustiest of all the languages that I speak. But, I still have enough there to be able to use it. But in comparison with German, I have to think about it much more when I'm speaking French.
Okay, we have a question for you already. Abdul Malik Maidi is asking, Abud, a friend of mine, is asking, what was his most memorable game?
That one I can answer very easily. I'll take you back to the year 2005, and I'm sure that there were many people in Nigeria who watched this game. You know what I'm going to say here, don't you? Milan against Liverpool in Istanbul, the Champions League final. And that was just so special on all levels. For starters, ESPN sent us out. You mentioned Tommy Smith, my partner with a Y. Tommy and I went out almost a week before the game to make programs. We did a program called Press Pass that used to be on the air, which you remember, and we have tremendous memories of. And we presented that program every day from our set in Istanbul with the Blue Mosque behind us, and it was just fabulous. And of course, we gave it the big build-up, not knowing that we were about to see probably the greatest European final ever played. And, who could have reckoned in advance that Milan would be 3-0 up after 40-odd minutes, that Liverpool would come storming back in the manner that they did, and that the Reds would then go on to win it on penalties in the fashion that they did. We came off the air that night just completely, exhausted emotionally because we put so much into the game, but it was such a joy. What a joy to broadcast that game. And I said to Tommy afterwards, I said, as broadcasters, we are so privileged to have done this. There will probably never be another European final like this in our lifetime. So, nothing to do with us. We were there, right place, right time, just like a striker putting the ball in the back of the net.
Interestingly, for some on the other side of the divide, and for Manchester United fans, 99 was supposed to be the most memorable final ever. Then 2005 came along and it had to be Liverpool. So imagine Liverpool stealing United's thunder again.
I can imagine if you're a United fan, you didn't particularly enjoy that, but no, I didn't. I didn't get to broadcast 1999. I wasn't on air for that one, but I did broadcast Manchester United's victory over Chelsea in 2008, again with Tommy in Moscow. And that, as you remember, went on until about 1:30 in the morning, local time in Moscow. We didn't sleep at all. We essentially went straight to the airport to catch our flight after it. But that, again, was high drama. Not quite as dramatic, I would say, as Milan-Liverpool, because you didn't have a 3-0 and then a 3-3, but certainly up there and a very enjoyable final to cover in that Moscow backdrop.
Okay, so Abut is asking again, Messi or Ronaldo?
Both great, but Messi. And
Messi.
I can only say, you know, it's very hard because there'll be some days, if you ask me that question, I would say, oh, Ronaldo, oh, wonderful. But I think I'm more a Messi man in my core. What that says about me, I don't know. It doesn't mean I dislike Ronaldo. I think they're both geniuses, and I think we're privileged to see them in action at the same time over a good number of years. But I think with Messi, what's special for me with Messi is that I was working on La Liga during the time when he came through. So I saw all his early games. We would do every Barcelona match. And as a commentator, I would see him. And I just thought, this reminds me more than any footballer I've seen in the modern era of what it was like to play football with your friends on the street, in the park. You know, he just has that kind of quality. And even now, he has that quality of exuberance, of youthful exuberance. He's not a young man anymore, but you still get the feeling he is. You still get the feeling he's that little boy in Argentina, just having a game with his mates.
Oh, so take us for, especially for those who also, like I said, want to be commentators, take us through what kind of relationship you need to have with your co-commentator.
Great question. I think this has evolved over a number of years. When I first started, the idea of a co-commentator hadn't really come in. You know, there sometimes was a co-commentator, but he would speak maybe once every 5 or 10 minutes. It was quite a detached kind of relationship. Nowadays, it's more you're joined at the hip and you're very much a team. And I think that on balance, broadcasting is better for that. But it is very important to have that relationship with the co-commentator. It doesn't mean that you necessarily always agree with the co-commentator or that he agrees with you. There has to be some sort of dynamic, though, between the two of them. And with Tommy on ESPN, we did have a dynamic. We were very good friends. We disagreed. You know, we didn't see life the same way. You probably will have detected that if you watched us. You know, Tommy was more the sort of the showman. I was more the sort of straight to the point, kind of keep it on the focused on the game kind of thing. You know, Tommy would come away with his anecdotes and his jokes and his quips. And I think sometimes that can work very well. I think if you have two people who are not the same, who have different personalities, one can complement the other. I've also heard it work the other way, where you have two people who are similar and just sort of get each other on all levels. I think with tactical analysis now, it has come a long way. And we're all in awe of having somebody next to us who really is well versed in the tactical side of the game and can explain that to the viewers, because, you know, I can do a basic job of doing that as a commentator, but I haven't played the game at a high level. So if I have somebody next to me, like, for example, Gary McAllister, great Scotland player, Liverpool, Leeds. He was one of my co-commentators when I worked in the UK. And I used to very much enjoy listening to what he had to say. Craig Burley, another one who I've worked with a lot down the years. So guys, you know, like that, who just in a couple of sentences can sum it up for the viewer, worth their weight in gold.
You know, last week I had a session for coaches on this platform, and there's a bit of a dichotomy between coaches that played the game and those that came into coaching from the love of the game. And there seems to be a bit of tension between both. So if I were to ask you, which do you prefer? A co-commentator that is an ex-player or a co-commentator that is a fellow broadcaster like you? And in your experience, which would you say has performed better in terms of both classes of commentators?
I think, to be honest, you probably could find good examples in both categories and not such good examples in both categories. So I guess what I'm really saying is it depends on the person and on the personality, because it is television and not everybody is suited to television. So, you know, for example, you might find somebody who has a very strong on-air personality. Maybe he's not quite as good at explaining the tactics, but you sort of forgive him because he's coming up with other things that make the viewing experience a wonderful one. On the other hand, you could have a coach who knows all the ins and outs of the game, but maybe doesn't explain it so well on TV, or maybe the presence isn't as great. So I think it's all really about the individual person and how well suited they are. I think in an ideal world, you probably would have somebody who ticks both boxes. So somebody who really can explain the game at a high level and in a way that is highly understandable, but at the same time has that strong personality. TV is not for everyone. That's the thing. And you do have to get a certain message across with TV, I think, as a co-commentator. My job as the main commentator is to identify who's on the ball, to sort of be a soundtrack without overpowering it. But the co-commentator's job is to take it a stage further, and I think to assist understanding, but in an entertaining and upbeat way.
Interesting. Is there any difference, like when you're approaching a game? Do you prepare differently if it's an ex-player or if it's a broadcaster? Do you prepare differently going into a game?
Probably not consciously, but I'm sure subconsciously I do. So if I'm working with somebody who I know is more the broadcaster than the tactician, I'll probably think to myself a bit more ahead of the game about the tactical side, because I'm probably going to have to fill in some of those blanks. If I'm working with somebody who is more the pure tactician, somebody who has a high level background in management, coaching, playing, and I can sort of almost not worry about that side of it, because I know that the co-commentator has got that covered. So most of the time, my focus is on saying the right thing at the right time, making sure that my homework has been done in such a way that, first of all, I know all the players, I can identify them, whether I see their numbers or not, and also that I have in my brain, I have a little story to tell about all of them that I may or may not use. Just depends on the circumstances, depends on the shot that I get from the match director, but I still have to do all that homework so that when the time comes and I need to utter that line, then I can do it. But in terms of the preparation, I think on the whole, it's the same job either way, irrespective of whether it's an ex-player, manager, or a fellow broadcaster.
Okay, let's take a question from the audience. Timmy, that's my brother actually.
Aha.
He says, did Tommy come up with the same old onion bag? And how was it working with him? I think you addressed that.
Well, Tommy would tell you, and I'll tell you too, that the expression onion bag goes actually back a long time, many decades in Britain and Ireland. If you look back at some of the old black and white footage, before the days of colour TV, of, cup finals in the 1950s and 1960s, you'll hear these kind of plummy, posh English voices saying, and Tottenham took the lead, and he puts it into the onion bag. You'll hear that kind of. So it does go back a long way, and of course, onion bags were pretty common. That's these string bags that you would use to store your onions. I remember that as a boy in the supermarket. Everything was always in the string bag. So I guess the net looked a bit like an onion bag to some people. So the phrase was coined on that basis. Tommy took it a stage further, and he made it the ould onion bag, ould meaning, old, which is the Irish way of saying it. And it became his line. And I think he always felt, he and I are different in this sense. Tommy always felt that, and this is probably his background in the USA. I didn't grow up in the USA or move here as early in my life as Tommy did. And there's a kind of a belief in American television that you need to have a line. You need to have a line that people kind of identify with you. So Tommy's line became the old onion bag, and he's used it to great effect down the years. What was it like working with Tommy? It was a joy. As I say, we had this kind of interesting relationship whereby we were always friends. I always liked to think that we had each other's back, you know, that we would always stick up for each other when it came to the crunch. But we still argued, especially on the Press Pass program. You know, Tommy would say things, and I would sort of shake my head and furrow my brow, and you know, there was that sort of healthy relationship of disagreement. And, you know, he knew that there were certain things that he said that I thought were rubbish, and he probably thought the same, same in return. But no, I still talk to him regularly. And in fact, have been broadcasting the NFL together in the last 3 years. That's a new project for both of us.
How's that going?
Oh, that's been great fun. We do that for Prime Video, and you can see it in Nigeria in theory, but it's during the night, so I know that the timing is not so great. But they came up with this idea that they wanted to reunite us on an NFL project, Prime Video, and give people a sort of a Champions League sound to the NFL. And I was determined when I moved back to the USA after being in the UK for a decade that I was going to try something different, new challenges, and that certainly has been a new challenge. So, so yeah, you know, Tommy and I go back a long way. And the one thing I would say is that whenever I pick up with Tommy, whether it's the NFL now or football, it's kind of the same feeling that you have when you put on, you know, the coat that just feels comfortable. You know, you just it's just like old times, and it doesn't need any kind of pre-rehearsed work. It just happens. It just clicks because we know each other so well.
The NFL. You need to tell me how you're able to manage that transition from regular soccer. Wait, have you been watching the sport before? Are you in tune with the sport? How have you been able to handle that transition?
Well, I have watched it for a long time. I first began watching the NFL in the 1980s. And then when I moved to the USA in the 90s, obviously it would be on every weekend. In those days, it was harder to get our football on television on a regular basis. So the NFL was on, so I'd watch it. And I'd go to some games locally here in the Boston area. The New England Patriots being the team. Back then, they were a terrible team. In the years after that, they went on to become the most dominant team in the NFL. So I had a working knowledge of it, but I'd never in a million years expected that I would ever be asked to broadcast the NFL. I thought, you know, somebody from Scotland, somebody who speaks the way I do, yeah, you know, for football, absolutely. But for the NFL, no, they want American voices for it. But Prime Video had the idea that there was a little gap in the market, that it might be attractive to a certain segment of the audience to have the British sound, but also two broadcasters who perhaps were known to a lot of people around the world for their work with football, making the transition to the NFL, as you've said. Initially, I had to get the rhythm of the game down because the rhythm is different, but the preparation is much the same. You know, it's still scribbling things on a sheet of paper. It's memorizing numbers more than appearances, more than physical appearances, because, of course, they wear helmets. The numbers are bigger, so that helps. And you get to kind of know where everybody should be on the field at any particular time, so that helps too. What I always say about the NFL is, in comparison with the sport that we grew up with, it's a bit like having a series of set plays. You know, it's like having a corner kick, a free kick, a corner kick, because that's really what the NFL is. It's set plays. It's pre-rehearsed plays that they all work on when they get ready for a game. And, you know, the quarterback or the head coach or the offensive coordinator, they call the play. You know, it's like calling a code number, and everybody, you know, makes a run or makes a move according to that code number, which, you know, happens too on the football field with set plays, with free kicks, with corners. So there are some similarities there, but you don't have the open play quality that we associate with football.
Okay, let me go to other questions that are popping up here. Timmy is also asking, have you been watching The Last Dance? And which footballer, if any, would you compare to Michael Jordan?
I've actually not watched it yet. I'm saving it for a rainy day, which I'm sure will be coming quite soon. But I hear wonderful things about it. And I look on social media and see how many people really have become immersed in the whole series, and, you know, with good cause, because we're talking about a special athlete, a once in a lifetime athlete. Who would I compare the great man to in our sport? I think the closest probably is Pele. And again, you know, younger people won't remember watching Pele. I only really saw him at the very end of his career.
Yeah.
But he was the footballer who made the worldwide impact in a way that nobody did, you know, growing up. There have been other great footballers. We have Messi and Ronaldo, as we've discussed nowadays. I just think Pele was the king. You know, and we called him the king. He was the footballing king for an entire generation. And, you know, his record speaks for itself. You know, 3 World Cups. And he just utterly dominated. And he had the giant personality to go with it as well. So I think I'd have to say the king in one sport, Jordan, the king in our sport, Pele.
All right, Tani is asking, hello, Derek. You've covered the Bundesliga for years. JJ Okocha was quite successful with Frankfurt. What do you think about him? Do you think if he was an European player, he would have been celebrated more?
Well, I'm glad you brought up JJ Okocha because he is a real favourite of mine. And I know he's a real favourite of many in Germany because his name comes up all the time when I work there. And yeah, I do. I think we're talking about a special talent. We're talking about somebody who played the game with real joy. And that's what I love with footballers when they do display that, because not everyone does, and everybody has a different personality. But he made a very big impression. And I think we need to recognize the contribution he made as a Nigerian playing away from home, not just in Germany, but in England as well. And just the extent to which he was an excellent footballing ambassador for Nigeria. So, yeah, it is amazing just how often the conversation turns to JJ when I'm talking to people in Germany. It happened quite recently when I was there. And people have very fond memories of him.
So Tani is also asking that, would you like to come to Nigeria and probably train a few Nigerians who might want to do what you do?
Well, if ever invited, it would be an honor. I've never been to Nigeria. I've always wanted to. It threatened to happen once for a FIFA youth tournament, but didn't happen. And it would be a great thrill to do that. Whether anybody would want my advice, I'm not sure. But someday it would be a fascinating experience. And I certainly have it on my bucket list to go to Nigeria at some stage.
All right, Tosi is asking, it was huge fun gleaming from you on those Champions League nights. You're an inspiration for me in commentary. Describe your time on the SoccerNet press pass, your best episode, your favorite press pass to ESPN FC. And Tosi is a Liverpool fan, by the way. He said your favorite Liverpool legend, Tommy Smith or Steve Nicol. And if ex-Liverpool players are the most eccentric commentators and pundits.
Thank you for the kind words, first of all. So a lot to unpack there. So press pass, first of all, favorite episode. I think I would have to give it to the episodes that we did live from site around the Champions League final. So I mentioned the ones in Istanbul. We did something similar in Paris the following year, Athens the year after that, Moscow following on from that. So they were all really special. And, you know, we had great access to guests and just having, as I said, the Blue Mosque behind us or the Eiffel Tower behind us and bringing the whole thing to life, you know, something special for all of us. Other episodes that stand out, I can't remember kind of any one in particular. All I remember is we would go in there on a Friday morning. You got to remember it was very early in the morning in the USA. And often it was snowy, you know, big blizzards outside. And we get in there at 5:30 in the morning. And Janusz Michalik, who was also part of the press pass team, you probably remember Janusz.
Yeah,
Janusz and I used to sort of get in before Tommy. And we would always say to each other jokingly, all right, we'd call Tommy the wee man, you know, the little man, the wee man was our nickname for him. We'd say, all right, I've got a feeling the wee man's going to be in a bad mood this morning. And usually when it was snowing and it was awful weather, he would come in with a big scowl on his face, and sure enough, he'd be in a bad mood. And if he was in a bad mood, it would usually be fireworks during the show. So that's what I remember most about the build-up to the shows. And he didn't disappoint. And that was a great thing, was that there was healthy disagreement on that program. It wasn't staged. It was simply, passionate exchanges. It's amazing to me how many people still contact us about those shows, because obviously nowadays you have ESPN FC and other great pundits on that show nowadays. But, we like to think that we kind of were the pioneers a little bit. And it did have its own vibe. So that was great fun. I forgot what the other part of the question was. It was about
Liverpool pundits. Are they the most eccentric?
They can be. Although I've worked with a few who are not. As I say, Gary McAllister, I would say not so eccentric, just, great guy and very easy to work with. Steve Nichols, eccentric, for sure. We love Stevie. He's a great guy and has a wealth of knowledge and experience. Of course, he's Scottish as well. And I think the one thing about that Liverpool team that Steve played for is that they were all football thinkers. And of course, they came through that school at a time when, Shankly had gone, but the imprint was still there of the great Bill Shankly, and then Bob Paisley took it on. And, Kenny Dalglish, of course. We're talking legends. And, it wasn't just by accident that Liverpool won all those European Cups back then. There was something special about the club, and it was a privilege to try to bring that out on the air. So Liverpool pundits are usually a lot of fun.
And he's asking, who's your favorite Liverpool legend?
My favourite Liverpool legend, I just mentioned him there, would have to be Kenny Dalglish. And again, that is because he's Scottish for starters, but not just that. I genuinely think that of all the footballers I have been around in my life, there has not been somebody who has dedicated himself to the cause of being a top footballer quite like Kenny Dalglish. And I watched him as a boy when he played for Celtic and couldn't believe how good he was. I wasn't a Celtic supporter, but of course I admired him greatly, and the Scotland player too. And then when he went to Liverpool, I think he showed that he was, if not the best player in the world, he was up there in the conversation amongst the best individual players in the world. But it was always allied to the team. It was never just about being great for the sake of Dalglish being great. It was always, for a bigger cause. And I don't think there's any higher praise than that.
So he's asking you, Tommy or Steve Nichol?
Both. Well, obviously, I've worked with both in different capacities. Tommy is always going to be the person that I feel closest to as a co-commentator, because we did so many games together and still do. I would love to actually track it someday if I have a bit of time. We're talking in the several thousands of games that we broadcast together. Stevie, great company, and play golf with Stevie now and again. He lives about 2.5 hours away from me. So occasionally Craig Burley and Steve and I, three Scots, often get together on the golf course.
Okay. Nick AGK is asking, these days, the football styles in Germany and England, from a tactical perspective, who do you think is doing it better? Who has the better of the tactical approach in football these days between German clubs and English clubs?
I like that question a lot. I'm probably going to say Germany. You might expect me to say Germany because I work a bit more in Germany than I do in England, although obviously I was in England for almost a decade. I think that Germany is more at the forefront of tactical innovations and development, and England seems to kind of catch up, maybe a couple of years behind. I think in Germany there is a strong emphasis on tactics. I think the differences are that at German clubs, they do things the way I see it, the right way around. So they decide what philosophy they want tactically and on all levels. They bring in a sporting director and his team who embody that philosophy. And then the coach who they choose also has to be somebody who buys into that philosophy. In England, they are kind of moving towards that much more, but it's tended to be the idea that you bring this kind of strong figure in, who can really dominate the dressing room by sheer force of will. And it's not so much about what tactical concept does that manager want to bring in. They more or less say, okay, we'll just trust that whoever comes in he'll know what to do, and on you go. But the problem is, the players who may already be on the staff from the previous manager might not be suited to carrying out those tactical chores. So that's why I prefer, on balance, the German system. And maybe it's why, to me anyway, German teams, while they don't quite have the money that English clubs do, they might be better in terms of tactical versatility, flexibility within games, because nowadays with German teams, most of them, you can write down the formation in the first minute and it might be, let's say, 3-4-3. But you have to keep your eyes on it, because after 20 minutes, it might have changed to 4-2-3-1, and this happens a lot in the game now in Germany. I'm not saying it doesn't happen in England, but I think it's more likely to occur in German football.
Let's quickly go to FIFA.
Sure.
Tokumbo is asking, and Jeffrey as well, they're both asking FIFA-related questions. Tokumbo is asking, will the commentary pairing of yourself and Lee Dixon on FIFA 19 and 20 continue in subsequent editions of FIFA? That's one. Jeffrey is asking, what's the process of the voiceovers like with EA Sports? Do you have to travel to EA headquarters for recording every year, or do they come up with additions to add to existing commentaries?
Well, the first part of the question, I can't answer at the moment, because as you know, I've been involved as a commentator on FIFA 19 and FIFA 20, but it's up to FIFA to decide with regard to the future editions how that goes. So that's all I can say on that subject at the moment. In terms of the process, we have spent the last 2 years about 20 to 25 days in a studio. And it's not always Lee and I together. Sometimes we do it separately. And it's a very creative process. I go in with a smile on my face every day, and I leave with a smile on my face. And, we put tremendous effort into it. You're exhausted by the end of it, because there's, a lot of creativity in terms of making sure the lines are the right lines. So they give us concepts. The producers give us concepts as to, what needs to be commentated on. I'm not seeing those exact incidents. I'm visualizing them. So, it might be a free kick just outside the box, and I have to deliver that as I would organically in a game, maybe 9 or 10 times, and the same with the names that we do over and over again with different inflections. So it's if I were doing your name, I would have a basic level, Adesanya, and then have a higher level, Adesanya, and then if there's a go, Adesanya, so you get the drift. That it's vocally challenging, but in a very good way, and it just depends. It depends on schedules, when we do it, and where, and it can be a bit of a movable feast.
Okay, so it's more in phases. It's not like you have a game that you're watching and you're running the commentaries. It's more in phases in terms of key aspects and key elements of the game that you record bit by bit.
That's right. And, obviously you'll hear certain lines maybe from previous years, and then new lines and new features. And I have to pay tribute to the creative production team, because, they spend hours and hours and hours just going over it all and making it the smooth package that you all know from having played it. And, the attention to detail is just incredible with regard to the game. Everything from the faces and making them look lifelike, and they are lifelike, to the crowd, to the commentary blending in, to introductions, to lines during the game, to goals, all of that. And we're just small pieces in the grand scheme of it. But it's a great thrill to do it, and I must say it was a tremendous honor to be asked to do it, knowing how iconic FIFA is around the world.
Let me tell you one part of FIFA that kind of annoys me. Anytime I'm playing a league game, and I was using Hamburg in FIFA 19, and then Martin Tyler says something. Okay, we're at Hamburg today. We're at the Volksstadion, and the next thing, Alan Smith says, "Oh, I haven't been to this stadium before." And I'm like, "Hey, you were here just a few moments ago in the other game. Why are you telling me you haven't been to this stadium before? You're just here."
Well, obviously with the game, that is, occasionally going to happen. But we do try very hard to edit ourselves with lines like that, because obviously it's something that I might say. If I were at, say, the stadium in Belgrade for the first time, in real life doing a game, I might say, well, it's a real privilege to be here for the first time. But, with FIFA, it's different because you may just have heard me commentate from that stadium. So it's a matter of just trying to weed these things out.
Okay, if he's asking, please ask about the performance pressure placed on commentators week in, week out, and how you cope with it. It can't be easy keeping viewers infotained.
Yeah, the pressure. I think we all feel pressure. It's a matter of how we handle that pressure ourselves. I think there is always adrenaline with a commentator, even though, and I've been doing it for more than 30 years, it's still pressure packed, and you still go into a game with the heart thumping. And I think the day the heart is not thumping is probably the day that you give up, because you need that healthy tension before a match, just like a player does, just like a manager does. I think the trick is to keep calm. And I always do that. When I feel that heart thumping just before a game, I always say, just be calm. You know what you're doing. You've done this countless times before. Just do what you've always done. And, I'm assuming most commentators do that. I speak with fellow commentators a lot about the tools of our trade. And they will say the same thing, that they have this adrenaline rush, but, they know through experience how to handle it. I think for freelance commentators nowadays, it can be quite hard, because you probably noticed this in Nigeria. You might hear the same commentator 3-4 days or nights running, and
Yeah.
If it's 3 or 4 days or nights running, that commentator hasn't been home very much, and he's probably been using every spare moment to prepare for a future commentary. And I find, particularly during World Cups, you don't sleep very much. I never have been a good sleeper during World Cups. Even though I love every moment of it, there is a tension there, because you're in this forum where all of a sudden you're thrust into sort of a game, if not every day, then every other day, and then the day when you're not working is a travel day. And it can take its toll. And when you finish a big tournament, mentally, you are just shattered. You are ready to pack up and take a break for a few days. But that's as it should be, because it means you're putting everything into it. So pressure is part of the job, but, let's face it, it's a very good pressure. And we all, as commentators, know that we're very lucky to be able to broadcast the most popular sport in the world.
So talking about commentators, Tyler is asking, have you worked with Ian Dark and or Peter Drury? And how do you rate both of them?
Well, the interesting thing is that I've never worked with Ian and Peter directly, because, of course, we do the same job. So we're never going to be paired together in a booth, in a commentary box, just because we're all main commentators. But what I can tell you about Ian and Peter is that they are two friends of mine. Ian is my regular golf partner. We play golf a lot together, especially when I was in England, and Ian lived not too far down the road. And Ian is probably my best friend in the broadcasting business. So we chat regularly. We compare notes regularly. In fact, I was just talking to him at the weekend there. He was doing a Bundesliga game. He doesn't normally broadcast the Bundesliga. So when he does German football, I always talk to him and just mark his card on certain things. And he's a great guy. He's a funny guy. Great sense of humor, distinctive voice, and I know loved by viewers around the world. Peter, again, somebody I know well and respect immensely, and every commentator in the business will tell you that they have the utmost respect for Peter Drury. What I like about Peter is his generosity to other people in the business. He's an extremely modest man. There is not an arrogant bone in Peter Drury, I will tell you that. And he has a commentary style which is very much his. And I always think that, and this is just an observation about other commentators who I think are the best in the business, like Ian and like Peter, they only need to utter one sentence and you immediately know who's talking. You know it's Ian Dark. you know it's Peter Drury. They had their own styles. They had their own ways of talking. They are tremendous communicators, and long may it continue for both of them.
Someone's asking, who do you think is the best manager in the last 10 to 20 years? Who would you rate number one in the last 10, 20 years?
Well, I would have to give it to the fellow we mentioned earlier from Scotland, Mr. Ferguson.
The last 10, 20 years?
Well, I'm talking just about he was obviously still managing in the last 10, 20 years.
Yeah, well, yeah.
So I've got to give it to him just as somebody who, I think honestly was way ahead of his time in terms of his methods, in terms of, what he did for, let's face it, a struggling club in Manchester United when he took over. They were not scaling the heights that they should have done. And he revolutionized that club. And when you look at United now, in the post-Fergie era, while he may not have been as effective as a manager as he was at the start of his United career, or at least, after the initial 5 years, he still was pretty good, and he knew what he was doing. And I think he sort of set the table for how you manage in that particular generation. I mean, I could mention a host of others in different countries who have been just as influential. Pep Guardiola obviously has to be mentioned as somebody, if you look at specifically the last 10 years, as does Jurgen Klopp. I think both the very highest echelon. And another person I would mention, even though he had a difficult time earlier in his career, would be Jupp Heynckes, the way he kind of evolved again right at the end of his managerial career.
From Real to Bayern.
Yeah, as a coaching icon. So there's so many. But I do think that, and part of it is the fact that I grew up with him as our manager in Aberdeen. But I think Fergie takes some beating.
All right. Abdul Malik is saying, what do you think of football without fans? And it's interesting that you, because of your location, you can't run commentaries on the Bundesliga.
Yeah, well, I have commentated on games before with no fans, and for a commentator, it's very hard, just as it is for a viewer. You don't have the same intensity, not any intensity, and you don't have this soundtrack that you can work off. I mean, we're so used to, as commentators, knowing when we can pause because the crowd is going to provide the soundtrack. You know when a shot comes in and it just sizzles wide of the post, you're going to get that ooh sound, and that's, as a commentator, you just train yourself to say nothing. But when there are no fans, it's different. It sounds different, it feels different. But it is what it is. It's what we're going to have to deal with for quite some time in world football. There's absolutely no way around it. So, I think as a commentator, you do have to change your technique a little bit, and perhaps it means talking slightly more to fill in the gaps that ordinarily wouldn't be necessary.
All right. Kelechi Nkoro is asking, as a Scottish commentator, how are you able to break through the RP accent demands / barrier, retaining your original accent? You still became a household name in these countries and regions.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. What I would say is, if you heard me in my early years at BBC Scotland, my accent was probably slightly more RP. And it's funny, I've listened to a lot of other people from that era. I didn't necessarily know that I was sounding more RP, but a number of top broadcasters now got their starts in the 1980s. And I think you did have to have a bit more of the RP about you. It still, would have sounded Scottish to anyone. But I think that has gradually been relaxed in the years after that, so that in the UK, and the UK is this kind of, mishmash of many different accents. You travel 20 miles and the accent changes. And I think it's great that so many of the accents that you hear from British broadcasters that go around the world now are accents that are not just that one kind of RP voice, the traditional BBC voice. You still will hear it. And of course, it's a function of where you grew up. The interesting thing is, in Scotland, people tend to think I don't have much of a Scottish accent, but people from outside Scotland, certainly English people always can hear it. Here in the USA, not so much. They just sort of think, oh, it sounds vaguely British. But but I'm very proud of where I'm from. And the main thing is that you have clear diction. So the main thing is that, you can have your own accent, but as long as somebody can understand you. And I think accents are great things. We all have quirks. In Scotland, we tend to roll our R's much more than they do in England. But, that's part of life's rich pageant, as they say.
Oh. Talking about commentators, Jeffrey is asking if you've ever called a game where you felt sympathetic to another team's cause and then they lost, and how were you able to control your emotions live if yes, if you had to had that kind of experience?
I'm trying to rack my brains. I'm sure that has happened. I'm trying to think of when it might have most notably. There's nothing really coming to mind of a time when I felt an injustice was done. I do remember doing a Scotland game against Italy, and obviously Scotland's my country, but I wasn't doing it for a Scottish audience. But I do remember it was a very important qualifier for, as I recall, Euro 2008. I think it was before that tournament. And,
the one with the two-legged affair with England?
No, this was, well, that would be one, but I don't think Scotland deserved it over the course of the two games. This was later, and Scotland played Italy. Scotland were in a group with Italy and France. And I remember it was 1-1 near the end of the game. Scotland were giving it a real go. And then the referee gave Italy a number of very dubious decisions, it seemed to me. And objectively, taking aside the fact that I'm Scottish. And I was a bit worried about it after the game because I thought, I hope I didn't come across as a Scottish, homer, if you like, there. And I don't think I did, because I showed it to people who weren't Scottish, and they said, no, the referee's completely done Scotland in there. He gave Italy a free kick, which they scored from, and that was it. And that was the end of the dream. And so that's one that really jumps out at me, obviously being Scottish. There will have been others. I just, for the life of me, can't pick out one at the moment.
As a commentator, how do you react to when you see a referee consistently making bad calls? How do you react?
As a rule,
or how does it make you feel?
Well, as a rule, I am actually quite sympathetic to referees, because one of the privileges that you have as a commentator on site is you're in the tunnel area before the game, and if you're covering one league over and over and over again, you get to see the same people. That means you get to see the same referees over and over again. So a kind of a friendship builds up. And, I probably know a lot of the referees better than players because of that relationship, because they arrive around the same time we arrive, and there's always kind of common cause, and you talk it over. And I often think that referees are a bit like commentators and vice versa, in that, we love the game, but sometimes we can, come in for quite strong criticism from people who think that, we're just incompetent, or we got this wrong, or, what was he thinking about there? I'm conscious of the fact that I couldn't referee a game to that level, and that it's impossible to get everything right as a referee. I mean, you're having to make these instant judgments all the time. You have to have eyes in the back of your head. It's just impossible to get it right. So you're kind of on a hiding to nothing going in. Having said that, I've seen some terrible refereeing performances, and I have indeed thought to myself, how on earth did he not see that? But I usually temper it with a bit of understanding for referees, knowing how difficult the job is, and knowing that it's very easy to be critical.
Do you remember the worst one you've encountered, the worst referee performance?
Again, I can't pinpoint one that makes me shudder. I mean, there have been times. No, I honestly can't. I can't think of one occasion where I thought that referee just completely got everything wrong. I'm just being honest.
So, what is the cultural benefits for you and the differences in doing commentaries across different countries?
Well, for me, it plays to my interests, first of all. I'm a little bit kind of restless all the time, in the sense that I like my football so much. I don't like it to just be the same football all the time. So I enjoy very much, comparing and contrasting different brands of football, whether that's, in France, in Germany, in Nigeria, in Korea, in the USA here, because it is the same game, but the styles can be different. And I'll tell you, when I was a young commentator at my first World Cup, 1990, I had done a tremendous amount of work on the countries I was covering. Maybe too much preparation, you could say, because sometimes you can over-prepare. But Costa Rica, for example, were in Scotland's group, and nobody knew anything about Costa Rica. There was no knowledge base in those days. You couldn't really go to, DVDs.
No Google.
No Google, no internet, none of that stuff. So that to me called for old-fashioned research. So Costa Rica were reclusive. They wouldn't let anybody near them. Mainly, possibly nobody wanted to go near them because there wasn't that same interest in research. But I made my producer, and I'm grateful to him to this day, I made him join me in this trek across Italy to their training camp. And I got all this incredible information, which I was able to use on the air. And Costa Rica beat Scotland, by the way, 1-0, and made it from that group as the second team behind Brazil. But I remember thinking about that experience and saying to myself, always go into a big tournament with a breadth of football knowledge. And I think as a commentator, you're at a disadvantage if you go in with only the knowledge of one league. Because the great thing about the World Cup is the stories come from multiple
all over the place,
all over the world, even leagues that normally don't get a lot of focus. So if you do have as your kind of your base knowledge, knowledge of other leagues and an interest in other leagues, I think it does serve you well as a commentator in comparison with only knowing about, for example, the Premier League.
I had a similar experience. Well, preparing for the AFCON last year, I did a preview with Tim Cable, used to be with Eurosport, and I had to start having to dig into some players from Madagascar who were interested in Nigeria's group. And obviously, the information was very limited because they didn't have any players playing at the top level. Probably the best players they had were playing in Asia or in South Africa, and probably one was playing in the third or fourth division in France. So I do appreciate the extent of work you have to do to dig into some of these countries that are not top of the range, countries. Amos is asking, how long does it normally? You answered the question on preparation, but how long does it take you to prepare for a game? I have this game. It's next Saturday. How long does it take you to prepare?
Okay, so if it were, a week away, let's say I got the assignment a week before the game, and let's say I didn't have much between getting the assignment and then the game, it would be a little bit every day, building up to, many hours the day before the game, but it probably would be, 3 or 4 hours every day between that point and the game. I always say that at a minimum for every game I do, we're probably talking about 3 whole days of preparation, not all done at once. A few hours here, a few hours there, but it would add up to about 3 days. And it continues right up until kind of a couple of hours before kickoff. There's still little things that I'm filling in on that sheet that I mentioned earlier. So it's a constant work in progress, I would say.
All right. Jeffrey is asking that which stadium do you think has the best atmosphere that you have commentated on the game?
Well, my favorite stadium to work from is the Signal Iduna Park in Dortmund.
Dortmund.
Yeah, that is my favorite. And I've been lucky enough to be there on big days and big nights. And I've always said that if I could choose the place where I would do my last commentary, then I probably would choose the Signal Iduna Park, because I think it is special. The Westfalenstadion, of course, the Dortmund fans really like to call it, without the sponsor's name. But it's just, to me, a cathedral of football. Dortmund is a working class city. It's not a monument of a city, but it has a monument of a football stadium. And it's all, to do with the industrial past of that region. You can feel it every time you go there. And I always just take a few seconds when I go to Dortmund to walk around the stadium again, just to, to get that scent in your nostrils, because it's pure footballing heaven.
What's your take on the use of stats in the assessment of players today?
Well, I think it's come a long way. There was a time when we used to kind of, turn our noses up at stats, and we thought, football doesn't really need statistics. It's such a simple game. It's a pure, beautiful game. We don't need numbers. I think it's evolved. I think in Germany it has evolved a bit more than it has in England, although it's evolving in England. Here in the USA with MLS, it's very much stats heavy. If you look at some of the sheets that you get from MLS headquarters, they're very heavily stats driven. I think that what I would say about stats is that they've helped me to have a better understanding of players and their strengths and weaknesses, so that if I don't know a team particularly well, I will go over the stats now and just have a look at, individually, what is a player contributing. And, some players are fast, and you can tell that by the stats. You can tell what their sprints are showing, for example. You can tell also, how many kilometers are covered by particular players in a game. Do they set up goals? Do they shoot? Are they good in the air? You can tell all these things now by looking at a stat sheet. You still need to use your eyes to watch a game and to see it for yourself. But I think they can be there to enhance. I think they're a pinch of salt. They're a bit of seasoning, if you know what I mean. To go with the rest of the dish. They should never become the whole dish, but
Exactly.
they're there to add a bit of flavor.
Exactly, I agree with that 100%. I have this argument with people, and some of them are actually on this live about stats. I feel that when I'm doing my analysis, it's the last consideration for me. When I'm trying to assess a player, the performance of a player, stats come last for me. Especially like when I'm trying to pick my team of the week, every week for my radio program, it's the last thing I consider. So that's, like I said, I have two players vying for a position that I saw them over the weekend. The stats is what I was, okay, let's see which one had the better stat. That would then probably tilt it in favor of one player over the other, but it's not my major consideration.
Sure, yeah.
Osita Madrogu is saying, nice touch with the Nigerian jersey.
See, proud of it. Proud of the shirt.
Eri is asking, what's your advice to young people that want to follow in your footsteps?
Well, the advice would be, first of all, believe in yourself. Believe that you can do it. I mean, I didn't come from any privilege or money or connections. I simply was a young person who had a dream. And, I maybe figured out early on that if I was going to fulfill the dream, I had to work really hard. So work hard, put all that you can into it if it is your dream. But know you can do it. Know that if you work on your technique, and that means your voice and, practicing and trying to perfect it, listen to commentators who you respect, and try and sort of work out in your mind, what is it that they are doing that makes them special to my ears? And, you can do that, but it still should be you. It should sound like you, but it takes work. And I always say, going back to the voice, it's a bit like a singer. If you think about how a singer trains his or her voice, and I speak to singers all the time, they'll go before a studio session, they will make sure that they can hit their high notes and their low note, and it's the same for a commentator. We have to be versatile vocally. So that means that, when everybody else is out having a party on a Friday, you're going to be resting your voice. But, work hard and believe in yourself are the main things.
Osita is asking, what's the difference between, running commentaries on a game you're watching, via the broadcast studio, as against the one you're watching in running commentaries, on in the actual stadium?
Well, it's the same job. You're essentially commentating the same way. The difference, I suppose, would be that when you're in the stadium, you are looking kind of at the field in front of you and at the monitor. If you saw me during a game that I'm broadcasting from the stadium, you'd be surprised that my eyes are kind of looking sort of halfway between the pitch and the monitor, because I have to be aware of both, so that you know, when you see on air a change of shot, so a close-up of a manager, I've got to make my comments be in tune with that. So if I'm looking at the pitch and that you're seeing the manager and I'm talking about what's happening on the pitch, you're going to say, well, why is he talking about what's happening on the pitch when we're seeing the manager and he's talking about a different person or whatever? So that's why, even though when you're in the stadium, you still have to kind of do this sort of looking up, looking down, looking up, looking down. Now, when you're in a studio during the game off monitor, then it does actually simplify it because you're just looking at the one picture. The advantage we have nowadays is often that we'll have a second monitor above the main monitor. So the main monitor is showing what you are seeing at home. But then on the higher up monitor, we have what they call camera one, which is basically the view of the game from the high camera on the halfway line, and it never, you know, cuts in or out. And that's quite handy because that allows us to, for example, if there's a doubt about whether a corner kick or a goal kick has been given, if you just rely on the main TV shot, you won't always know because you'll see both players appealing, but you won't see the referee pointing to the corner flag or goal kick. But with this other camera, it means as soon as that situation manifests itself, I just change my eye line to the upper camera and go, okay, corner kick's been given because I can see the referee pointing to the corner. So that's where it's helpful. But the job is really the same. You obviously prefer to be in the stadium, but it's not always possible.
Okay, so he's asking again, you talk about footballers for a living, or do you often meet these guys in person? Any close friendships with any famous footballers? And feel free to name drop.
Close friends. Well, we don't get to really meet footballers now the way we did. 30 years ago, it was a different game. So, we would meet footballers all the time back then. The Scotland players I covered, and Steve Nicol was one of them. You would see them socially too. You would meet them for a drink now and again. All that has changed, and these footballers are superstars in a way that they weren't before and are shielded from anything like that. The footballers who I have close friendships with are mostly footballers I've worked with on television. So people who I maybe knew casually when they were still players, but they become fellow broadcasters, then they often become friends, So people like Stefan Freund in Germany, who is a familiar voice on the Bundesliga and played for many years in England as well. People like Craig Burley, who you might know from ESPN, who I knew a little bit before ESPN started in the UK and then became very friendly with subsequently. Chris Sutton, another one I became very friendly with through traveling. And Chris obviously was a top level striker in England, particularly during his time with Blackburn Rovers. So they would be the main ones I would call friends, but, passing acquaintances, somebody like Michael Ballack, whenever I see him, we always have a great chat because I worked with him closely at ESPN on one of the tournaments a few years ago. And obviously being a German speaker, we have that in common too. So that would be just a few.
All right. So what would you say has been the effect of goal line technology on the game, obviously with respect to commentary and most importantly, VAR? Are you for or against VAR?
Well, I'll answer goal line technology first. I think it has assisted. I think it has helped in a dramatic way since it's come in. It's simple, but it's effective. It certainly works, and it just takes the ambiguity out of it. As a commentator, it took a little bit of adjusting to just the whole watch system and but now we know it and it's fine. VAR, I'm probably more pro VAR than most people, and that may be because I saw it come in early in Germany and they had a whole season where they didn't use it in games. It was merely a trial run exercise, so it would be done as though VAR were an operation, but not rolled out online, so to speak. And I think they did their homework, and it did have early teething troubles. But fundamentally, I've in recent years come around to the way of thinking that there's something wrong if, say, you at home in Lagos are able to tell that the referee has made a mistake, and somebody sitting behind the goal at the same game on his or her smartphone can tell the referee has made a mistake. but the referee doesn't know he's made a mistake. And it comes back earlier on to what I said about how difficult it is to be a referee. I think anything that we can do to help referees make the right decisions has to be a good thing, has to be a positive. And I think in England, it has not been used in as effective a way as in certain other countries, particularly Germany. They're still learning. We've got to give it time. I think in a few years' time, we will look back and view games from, 2015, 2016 and wonder how on earth did they get by without VAR? That's just my opinion.
My worry for VAR has to do with the lack of consistency.
Yep.
I have a huge problem with that because you watch one game now, by the time you see the next live game, almost similar incident happens and you have a different outcome. So for me, I think consistency is what we need to find.
Yeah, and I think that's totally fair, valid comment. I think it's still feeling its way, particularly in countries that are relatively new to it. I think what has not helped in the last year or so is the fact that we've had new interpretations on so many fronts, particularly handball. That is coming at the same time as VAR. And I think that has led many people to say, oh, VAR is the problem, when in fact, the difficulty is with a new modern interpretation of handball. So, I think every year the lawmakers need to look very closely at what they're doing to help referees be consistent.
For instance, the game at the weekend, RB Leipzig versus Freiburg.
Yep.
Freiburg scored a late winner, supposed late winner, and the goal was chalked off because the guy's hand was offside. My take is, his hand being offside doesn't give him an advantage because he wasn't even involved in the play at all. The ball didn't even come to him. So, but the goal was chalked off. And for me, that is where I have a problem because even in England, you're having to narrow down the offside to as little as your armpits, your toe, your hair. That's the problem for me.
Yeah, it's new and it's different. And I look at it maybe more from the point of view that I would rather that we go to the nth degree on these things than the old days when you would look at a linesman, as we called them, assistant referee, and you would know that he's just guessing. He's making a pure guess with no way scientifically of getting it right. I'd rather go to the science than not, but I accept your point that when it does get down to these very narrow decisions, it can be frustrating. It still needs to be refined a little bit, but I think we're on the right path with it. Again, just my opinion.
Okay, have you met John Motson and Martin Tyler?
Yes, I have, many times.
Right. I particularly like John Motson. I think John Motson used to do FIFA too before.
Yes, he did, yeah.
With Andy Gray. It used to be John Motson and Andy Gray. They used to do FIFA before as well.
Yeah, John is a great commentator and absolutely legendary in the UK. I grew up listening to him on the BBC. And he was on FIFA and in fact came back to do a small feature for FIFA last year, I believe it was, on FIFA 20. John is still around, and Martin, of course, the voice of football for so many people around the world still.
Yeah. Okay, Nick is asking, we've heard of clubs with the big pockets finding a way around FFP rules and go off with a fine and not a punitive punishment. Do you think UEFA is doing enough for equality purposes for all clubs as the Saudi billions are about to be unleashed at Tyneside?
It's a difficult question. Probably not is the answer. I think this is just a personal opinion, I think we're in for different times with regard to football as a whole. I think that COVID-19 is going to change a lot of how football is run. I think from the business point of view, I think that a lot of people will be examining football in a way that they weren't before. And it remains to be seen exactly how that will play itself out. I can, speak to the German example. They are already discussing ways of being a more modest industry going forward. That football has been sailing too close to the wind. The fact that clubs are in danger of going out of business just because they can't play for a few weeks, I think that should make us all think, pause and think a little bit. We love football, but what is it we love about football? Is it the money? Is it the huge transfer fees?
The glamour?
Is it all of that, or is it actually just the game? And I was reminded recently watching some matches from my youth during this lockdown period. I was reminded of how joyous occasions these games were back in the 70s and 80s when there wasn't the same money. It was top level football at the time. We still loved it. So I think there'll be some soul searching.
All right. What are your thoughts on the evolving broadcast landscape? You spoke about doing something for Prime. What's your take on that? Because it seems that is increasingly a direction a lot of the leagues will be going to. I understand the Premier League are also considering something similar to Netflix to have their games on that. What's your take on that segue?
Well, I was also involved with Prime Video last December when they had 2 match days of the Premier League in England just for the UK audience. And again, this was quite revolutionary in England. So the idea was that you could pick your own game on your device, no matter where you were watching Prime Video. If you're a Wolves fan, I was doing one of the Wolves games, then you could watch the Wolves game. You could watch a bounce around show from one game to another, watch all the goals as they go in. You could do anything you wanted with it. So I think that comes down to choice. Now, this has been offered in Germany for a number of years. They call it the Konferenz in Germany, and essentially it's a program where you just, you start at one game, you switch to a commentator at another. As a goal goes in, you shout goal in Augsburg, you switch there, and it's very exciting, very dramatic. So my guess is, my hunch is that this is where the industry is heading, and we will see more in the way of choice. And I think viewers will want that choice, different ways of watching the games and consuming the product.
Okay, Kelechi Okoro is asking a question along the lines of commentary. What do you advise an African commentator who wants to break into the international space, especially with a lot of media houses here in Nigeria asking us, commentators and the likes, to lose their regional accent?
Well, I'm always disheartened when I hear that people have to lose their regional accents. Hopefully there's a balance that can be struck, maybe similar to the one that I've had to strike, which is still sounds, Nigerian, still sound African, but, get yourself the gig at the same time. It's a difficult one because TV producers are always going to have their specific requirements when it comes down to a commentator. I always say, don't lose yourself in the process. Still sound like you. And, everybody can speak clearly. As I say, if you heard me talking to my relatives back in Scotland, you might not understand a word, because we would speak in our own dialect and everything. But, I have a way of talking when I'm on the air that is clear, hopefully. And so clarity is what you have to go for, but never sacrifice yourself. Never lose yourself.
Yeah, I saw your email.
Can you hear me, Derek?
I can hear you. Yeah, I heard somebody else there.
Yeah. That was a bit of an error. All right. Thoughts on equal pay in sports?
You're talking about between men and women?
Men and women, yeah.
Well, I think that I'm living in a country where this topic has been discussed a lot, and I think with good reason. I think that, we should, again, my opinion, we should be striving for equality in this world. A woman, deserves the same treatment as a man. And, equality for all should be the way that we go forward on this. Now, I think it's particularly sensitive here in the USA because in the football world, it's the US women who have been the trailblazers. The US women are, relative to their competition, the best team in the world. And they gave, so much joy to the world with what they did at the Women's World Cup last year in France. As I said, I was there. The US men, in comparison, not so much, yet they get paid more. I quite liked what the Norwegian players did a year or so ago. The Norwegian men, and Norway is often at the forefront of equality campaigns. They decided, okay, if you're not going to do it yourselves at federation level, we'll just decide to do it, and we will sacrifice payments so that the women can get equal pay. So I think there are solutions like that out there if people want to open their minds.
I have a different opinion, and it has to do with tennis. Now, in tennis currently, equal pay exists, especially for the majors, right? But the men play 5 sets. The women play 2 sets. Okay, maybe 3 sets. Where's the equality in that?
Well, again, I'm talking about football here, and to me, it's the same game. It's the same game that they're playing, the highest level that they can play in terms of the Women's World Cup. And I also think that we need to make a stand to encourage women to play football. You know, I think the more we do that, the more complete the sport becomes. It's the most popular sport in the world, but it's, you know, it's the simplest sport in the world to play as well. I just think that it's the right thing to do in this day and age.
Okay, so let's talk about Scottish football. You know,
sure.
The state of Scottish football. Yesterday, Celtic were named champions.
Yep.
Even though I do know that Rangers won't have liked it, and I understand that Hearts are looking to go to court with respect to that. Well, what's your take on that and the state of Scottish football generally, especially on the international front?
Well, on the league this season, as you said, the campaign has ended and Celtic have been declared champions, even though it's ahead of time. The season wasn't finished in terms of the number of games that were meant to be played. I think that everybody was on a hiding to nothing here. I think they had to come up with a solution. This seems like the only real solution, not a perfect solution, of course. I rather suspect Celtic were going to win the title comfortably anyway. I feel bad for Hearts because the gap there was not a big gap. But a stand had to be made somewhere. And again, Hearts fans will dislike it. Rangers fans won't like the fact that they didn't win the title. I don't really think they were going to win the title. So we must accept that this is an odd year because of COVID-19. And, you know, on we go, hopefully, at some point in the future. In terms of the state of Scottish football, I was back working there for almost a decade. And, you know, it's not what it was several decades ago when Scotland had some of the best teams in Europe, but that is to be expected. It's a small country of 5 million. We don't produce the footballers we used to, sadly, and that is a function of modern society and living in a cold, wet climate where it's frankly not easy to go outside and play football in the middle of winter for several months. In order to play football, you really have to rent high-level indoor facilities, and they are not easily available either. So all that works against a small Northern European country like Scotland, but the passion is still there. You know, trust me on that. And if you look at the attendance figures, there are still more people per capita of the population who go to football in Scotland on a weekly basis than in just about any other European country. So it tells you that it's still a football mad country. It always will be. I wish our national team were better, but it's been a long, disappointing, frustrating process. 1998, the last time that we played in a World Cup or indeed a major men's tournament.
I think the constant change of managers is also a problem. One manager comes in, he has his own style. Another one comes in, has his own style. I think Alex McLeish, the second, has had 2 spells now.
Yes, he has, yeah.
You had Gordon Strachan, then you had the guy at Hearts. It's been a bumpy road. But yeah. I expect that with the likes of McTominay being able to play at a top club, probably there's a bit of light at the end of the tunnel for Scottish football.
We hope. That's all we can do is hope, because there's an entire generation has missed out on, you know, what I grew up with, which was getting to the World Cup almost every time. 1974, 78, 82, 86, 1990, 98. You know, so we were at all those World Cups, but not since. And it's harder than ever to qualify, but we just have to hope.
Let's talk the MLS. Do you think that with what's happening and the few changes that happened, do you still consider it a retirement league? That's what most people term that. Is a league players come to retire at. We've had the Beckham experiment, which I think went very well. You had Steven Gerrard, you had Wayne Rooney, you had Zlatan at the point last season at LA Galaxy. Do you still think the MLS do you think it's growing? And do you think it's a retirement league? And do you think that they probably need to take a look at their transfer system? You know, the MLS also adopts the same transfer system they have for all their other sports, baseball, basketball, and the likes.
Well, I think MLS is a number of different things. I don't think it's a retirement league. I think it is a league that's multifaceted. I think it's become much more concentrated on younger players, particularly from a Latin American background, and trying to encourage them and provide a platform for them. Yes, they do have the older players who come from Europe. They're going to continue to do that because they do want players who have a certain name recognition. But it's this kind of mixture of different layers, MLS, the younger players, American players, older players from Europe, sometimes middle-aged players in football terms from Europe who don't have quite the profile of a Beckham or a Gerrard or a Lampard or someone like that, or a Schweinsteiger. So I think it's always going to be this way in MLS. I think it's still evolving. I covered it in its early years in the 1990s when it wasn't a very good standard at all. The standard is much higher now. I don't think it gives itself enough credit as a developmental league because mainly it doesn't like the title of developmental league. You know, it doesn't want to be seen as that, but I think there's nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, you know, most leagues around the world are by nature developmental leagues, and it's actually a sign that you're doing something right if you can call yourself a developmental league. On the transfer system, I might defend MLS a little bit more on this front because I think it's that system that makes it sustainable. Now, it's not my ideal model of how a league should be run. I much prefer the German system of members and people having a voting say in how things are done. But I get that they do need some level of stability. After what happened with the old NASL in the 1970s and mistakes were made, so that the whole point is to try to keep it all in-house and to try to keep it stable. And you have these owner investors, you know, who are very much at the heart of all of that. And most of the business is conducted within the league, so trades rather than transfers. But again, listening to the Bundesliga, that may be something we see more in Europe going forward as well, because I think we would all agree that football with the transfer system it currently has probably can't continue in this form.
Can't sustain it. Yeah, it can't be sustained. I had a football agent on this platform a few weeks ago. I had that conversation. He was telling me that I should watch out that you won't have any big major transfer deals with cash involved. You would have more swaps and loans going forward. And we're already hearing rumors concerning certain players that that's the kind of deal that is in the offing.
Yep.
African football. How much of African football have you been a part of? Have you tasted? Have you watched?
Not enough, to be honest. Not nearly enough. And it's my one regret that we don't, in the European world and in the US world, we don't get coverage enough of African football. I would love to be able to watch African football more regularly. The AFCON, I always try to watch as much of that as possible when it's on. But, Tommy and I used to take a big interest in the African Champions League going back to our press pass days. In fact, in those days, Tommy became a big fan of Enyimba when they were as good as they were, the team from ABBA. And, the People's Elephant, isn't it? Enyimba, isn't that?
People's Elephant.
People's Elephant. And, I think that the world would be a better place if we were all exposed to more football culture from different continents. And, Africa has produced so many terrific players who have gone on to ply the trade in Europe. But what we don't see is the origin story of that. And it's one thing I would love to be able to rectify if possible.
Tinkepu said the exact same thing. about African football, that it would be nice if you have more African football being shown across Europe and America. Even went further to say, if you look at all the games that you have today, FIFA, Football Manager, that there's very little African representation, and that he thinks that Africa itself needs to start thinking of developing its own, content in that line to probably use to boost the image and whatever of African football. Do you think an African team can win the World Cup?
I'm convinced it will happen in my lifetime, yeah. I've always thought it would happen. I actually thought it would happen by now because, you think back to how many, really enjoyable African teams there have been at World Cups. I mean, we've spoken about the Super Eagles already, but, you think back to that Cameroon team in 1990.
1990, yeah.
They gave England a heck of a fright in that quarterfinal, and I thought they were going to go on to beat them. It is time, isn't it? And we always say that because the talent is there, the passion is there, and passion is such a big part of it. So let us hope that this will happen. I'm 53, so I'm hoping to be around for a few more decades, and I hope to live through it.
Hopefully. I think we should be rounding up now. If you have any questions, please make sure you drop it in the chat section. We should be rounding up gradually. I think you've mentioned the favorite game you've had, which is the Liverpool 3-3 in Champions League. Your favorite footballer of all time, I think you've mentioned that as well. Have you?
Well, Pele would be the one that we said, compared to Jordan. My favorite footballer of all time would probably be, because again, Pele was at his best before I really started watching football, but I would have to say Johan Cruyff would be the one for me, because when I was growing up in the 70s, he was who we all wanted to be. There was nobody like him. And so for me, there will never be anybody quite like Johan Cruyff.
All right, now let's go into that, your all-time favorite 11. Now, so I asked Derek and said, I would like him to tell us what is a favorite all-time 11. What does it, and he came up with this. Dinosaur in goal, right back, Cafu. Probably is a 4-3-3 formation. So right back, Cafu, Paolo Maldini at left back, Franco Baresi and Franz Beckenbauer at centre back. In midfield, Lothar Matthäus and Johan Cruyff, and is joined by, surprisingly, JJ Okocha. Up front, Diego Maradona, Cristiano Ronaldo, and Lionel Messi.
Pretty good team, I think.
This team is too open. It'll be too open.
You see, there's a coach talking. I picked a team of my favorites. I'm not claiming this team, is the best of all time. I wanted it to be a team that reflected my passions, and also I wanted it to be a team of people who had played in a World Cup who I had watched, and they all fall in that category.
Too open. The only player in your midfield that has a little bit of a defensive bone in him
is Matthäus, and
it's because, as his career progressed, Lothar Matthäus is the only one. Unless you're expecting this team to keep possession all through, then you have Beckenbauer step into midfield. That's the only way this team will beat.
I still think they would find a way. I still think with that amount of talent, they would figure out a way to do it. But no, this was really just a dream team of people who I have enjoyed over the years, and I wanted to have JJ in there too. Not just for these reasons, but just because I think it would have been remiss of me not to have an African player in there. And we've spoken about the contribution Africa has made to the story of the World Cup. And again, tied in with my experiences in Germany, he was the obvious one. And, he's in pretty good company in that lineup.
I want to believe that Germany is your favorite league to cover, and is the easiest one for you to cover.
Germany's my favorite league on all levels, really, because, as I say, I have the backgrounds with the country and with the language and with the culture. And also, it is just such a watchable league. I always say to people, If you get the chance, if you're not a fan of the Bundesliga, just give it a watch. And obviously people did this past weekend, many who maybe don't watch the Bundesliga regularly. But I just think it is that perfect marriage of open, fast, technical football with interesting tactics, a little bit of the Premier League about it, but I think more emphasis on youth, and just has its own little tweaks that make it the Bundesliga, that make it Germany. And you can't go wrong if you watch it.
I believe that Kenny Dalglish is your favorite Scottish player of all time.
I'd have to say, yeah. I mean, he really was a class apart from everyone else, and consider myself very lucky to have watched him when he was in his prime.
And English player?
Best English player of all time, I would probably, and again, I'm going to go here for a natural talent, who I saw in the flesh, Paul Gascoigne. Again, you can tell kind of that I'm a bit of a football dreamer, when I rate players. And Gascoigne to me was a dreamer as a footballer. He could do things nobody else could do. You think about his goal against Scotland for England at Euro 1996. He had that sort of that daring about him. And, I wouldn't say consistently the best English player, but he speaks to my belief that football is about dreaming.
Wow. So, okay, let me go through the entire British Isles. Wales?
The best Welsh player I've ever seen, Ryan Giggs. No two ways about that. Just a wonderful pro, and a great example on the pitch. And streets ahead of his peers. He was unlucky to play at a time when there just wasn't realistically a way of Wales getting to a major tournament. But yeah, Ryan Giggs for me.
Northern Ireland and Ireland.
Northern Ireland's the best player for Northern Ireland, I think. Now, again, I'm going back to the days of, George Best, obviously, number one. And I saw Best just at the end of his career. It was a shortened career, but there'll never be a talent like George Best. And, it was a trouble-torn life, unfortunately. But George Best, absolutely class. Republic of Ireland, Liam Brady. Really loved watching Liam Brady back in the 1980s.
Arsenal?
At Arsenal, and of course in Italy as well, but at Arsenal, sensational. Again, an Irish player who, you could easily have thought was an Italian player or a Brazilian player. He was that good.
Final question. And does anybody have any question? Because we are about to go. Final question. What would you say is responsible for the influx of English players, young English talents, into the Bundesliga?
I think it's been a number of things. I think it has been a realization that something exciting is happening in Germany. It's not far from England. It's just a short flight. And I think young English players and their advisors have realized that they've been doing the wrong thing for a while. They've been pinning their hopes on staying at a big club and eventually getting their chance, and in some cases not getting that chance. They go to Germany at a young age. They get their opportunity. Jadon Sancho is the prime example. There are others too, other English players. Kenny. Exactly, John Joe Kenny at Schalke on loan from Everton.
Lukman.
Yeah, exactly, Lukman. We've seen Reece Oxford there as well. So, I mean, I think this is the start of a trend. I think that you're going to see more and more of this. And it is incumbent upon a player at a young age to decide what's best for his career. And it's been clear to me for a while that what's best is not to languish in the fringes of a big club when you can go and be playing in front of 80,000 people every week. Okay,
so one last question. Tipo Kessie just dropped the question. Said, will Scotland win a tournament in your lifetime, Derek?
Will they win a tournament? Probably no. I will settle for us just being at a tournament again in my lifetime. How about that one, Adeyemi?
I think that would be perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody that has joined in. I think I can now tell my mom that, Mommy, I made it. Derek, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for the depth of your knowledge. You have blessed all of us here on this outlet today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, blessings to everyone in Nigeria. Thank you very much for the invitation and for having me. Greatly enjoyed it.
I will make it a case in point to invite you to Nigeria very soon. Hopefully, when all these things, coronavirus clears, we'll have a chat around bringing you to Nigeria.
It's a deal. I love it.
All right. Have a lovely day. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you for joining up. We'll, I'll get this video across, we'll put it on YouTube so that we can relive this fantastic memory. Thank you for joining us, and have a lovely day.
Thank you, Adeyemi.
Thank you. Thank you, Derek.
Take care.